In today's video, I'm really going to be testing the limits of what constitutes fair use of copyrighted material with a discussion about the tube map, specifically something that happened to it in 2009. So as regular tube users will know, every 6 months or so TfL issues a new underground map. Their edition for September 2009 had a significant omission. It didn't include the River Thames. So a brief discussion of the map and what it's all about. In the early days of the underground, and by the early days I'm talking from about 1908 to 1933, tube maps included pretty much everything. Streets, green spaces, the Army and Navy stores for some reason, and they were geographically accurate. Yet at the same time, they weren't comprehensive. In order to make the crowded central London area readable, they had to omit a lot of the suburban sections. The breakthrough came from a gentleman named Harry Beck, who realised that actually you didn't need most of that stuff. For a tube map, all you really need to know is which stations are on each line, the order they go in, and where you can change trains. It doesn't matter if the stations are 300 yards apart or 3 miles apart, you're going to be on a train anyway. The result, devised in 1931 and published in 1933, is more of a diagram than a map. It bears little resemblance to what's going on the surface, but that's fine. It is a masterpiece of simplicity. It's easy to understand even with later additions such as fare zones and the continuing expansion of London's transport network. Of course, we do run the risk of the map becoming too crowded, perhaps in the not-too-distant future, but for now it represents the best solution. In fact, the concept is so popular that it's even been adapted elsewhere, but more on that in a little bit. The map also includes the river, which is a bit of an oddity. It could be argued that this is not necessary. It's not like the river affects the tube in any way, at least not from the perspective of the passenger. Yet the result of omitting it was uproar, at least uproar in that faintly passive-aggressive London commuter way. Then Mayor Boris Johnson personally complained to TfL about the omission and demanded its return. I think the issue is a psychological one. London is a city that's divided by the river. The city, i.e. the very centre of the ancient capital, is all north of the river. Cabbies are notoriously reluctant to go south of the river, although I have to say I've never encountered this problem myself. Historically, the city's authority ended at the river, and so the South Bank became the start of London's district for entertainment and sinful pursuits. I've even known people to get a bit tribal about it, which as somebody who's lived on both sides of the Thames is a little bizarre. From a more practical perspective, the argument for its inclusion on the map was that the river forms a physical barrier for anyone travelling on foot. You cannot walk from, say, Waterloo to Westminster without crossing the river. The counter-argument, of course, would be that the tube map is not designed for walkers, and even with the river it would be pretty useless. It doesn't show road or foot crossings. All in all, I would say that at the time it was pretty hard to make a practical argument for keeping the river. TfL stated that the decision to move it was based on customer feedback and that the map was becoming too busy. The map also removed the fare zones, which I would argue was a far worse move. Those are very useful for planning journeys if you're on the budget. Many was the time as an impoverished student when I'd get off the train at the edge of Zone 1 and walk in to save money. Ah, nostalgia. But still, crowded or not, the decision to omit the river was very unpopular, so it was added back in for the next edition. As a little side note, this controversy reminds me of a similar issue the New York subway had way back in 1972. The New York subway map is much closer to the pre-Harry Beck style. It includes a lot of surface features and is fairly geographically accurate. But in August 1972, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority introduced a new version designed by Massimo Vignelli that was much more akin to the London Underground way of doing things, although it did include a number of above-ground features like Central Park. And it was very unpopular. New Yorkers did not like their city being distorted and abstracted like this. By 1979, the MTA had reverted to the old design. There are all sorts of theories as to why the Beck-type map was an instant success in London, and indeed in other cities, but a total failure in New York. They range from the psychological to the geographical to the artistic, but there's nothing that really works, for me at least. For instance, I read one argument that Beck's map was more geographically accurate than the Vignelli one, which is patently untrue. Another said that the people of New York are proud of knowing their way around the city above ground, but I think that equally applies to Londoners. So really, who knows? I've never even been to New York, so you won't get a workable hypothesis from me. Since 2009, the tube map has become even more crowded, with the addition of TfL Rail, Thameslink and the Emirates Airline. But I would argue that the river has finally found a practical use on the map. In recent years, TfL has made more of the boat services on the Thames. With this in mind, the river has effectively become another transit route, with piers being depicted on the map. It's as if, after 80 years, the map finally remembered why it has the river down there in the first place. Good evening, I hope you enjoyed this purely abstract tale from the tube. If you did, then I'd be jolly pleased if you'd click the like button. And you could also subscribe if you haven't already for more content. Now, I must admit I'm pretty neutral on the river question, and I'm generally not really a map person, but I'd be interested to hear what you think. Should the river be on there? Is the map too crowded? What about the New York thing? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks as ever to my Ko-fi and Patreon donors. You are the Harry Beck to my confusing geography. And I'll see you all again very soon for another tale from the tube.